Most people think nations go broke when their treasuries run dry. Wrong. They go broke long before when they start believing that debt can replace discipline. Debt is not just a number on a spreadsheet. It's a story. A story of promises made in the past that must be paid in the future. And somewhere along the way, we forgot that the future has limits. By the end of this story, you'll understand how the modern world turned debt from a survival tool into the foundation of its entire empire, and why that empire is far more fragile than it looks. The story begins in Florence, 14th century. Before credit cards, before central banks, there were merchant families, the Medici, the Peruzzi, the Bardi. They didn't sell goods, they sold trust. Florence was a city of gold, but even gold wasn't enough. Trade was booming. Armies needed funding. Kings wanted palaces, popes wanted wars, but none of them had the money to pay up front. So they turned to the bankers. Loans were written on parchment. Interest was disguised under creative names to avoid the church's ban on usury. And slowly, debt became the secret fuel of power. When kings couldn't afford wars, they borrowed. When cities couldn't afford walls, they borrowed. And the more they borrowed, the more powerful the bankers became. For the first time, money created power instead of the other way around. By the 17th century, England was drowning in war debt. Fighting the Dutch, then the French, had emptied the royal treasury. So in 1694, a group of merchants proposed a bold idea. They would lend money to the crown in exchange for something extraordinary, the right to create money itself. Thus was born the Bank of England, the world's first central bank. The deal was simple. The bank would issue notes backed by government debt. In return, the government promised to repay, with interest, over time. But what seemed like a short-term fix became the blueprint for modern finance. The state could now spend before it earned. War no longer required gold-only confidence. That confidence became Britain's greatest weapon. With it, the British Empire financed ships, colonies, and industrial revolutions. Debt had turned from burden to engine. But every empire that borrows power eventually forgets who owns the ledger. Across the Atlantic, America's founding fathers learned the same lesson. The colonies didn't win independence with musket balls alone. They did it with borrowed money. To fund the war against Britain, they issued continental currency paper money backed by hope. It collapsed within years. By 1781, it was worthless. That's where the phrase, "not worth a continental," came from. But the idea survived. When the United States was born, its first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, had a radical belief. A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. Hamilton understood that debt could unite a country because creditors have a stake in keeping nations alive. If people are owed money by the government, they have reason to protect it. So the young republic borrowed heavily, built infrastructure, expanded westward, and industrialized. Debt became America's invisible constitution, the promise that tomorrow would always pay for today. By the 20th century, every major economy had embraced the same logic. Debt wasn't a danger, it was a tool. And after World War II, it became a weapon of growth. Governments realized they could spend endlessly as long as their citizens kept believing in tomorrow. They issued bonds, created welfare systems, built highways, fought wars, landed on the moon, all on borrowed money. Debt became the new gold standard. But unlike gold, it had no limits. Central banks could print, governments could promise, and voters could forget. The modern economy had discovered something extraordinary, a way to borrow not just money, but the future itself. The decades after World War II were a miracle of growth. Factories roared, highways stretched across continents, homes filled with new appliances, cars, and televisions. Governments called it the golden age of capitalism, but it was built on a mountain of credit. The war had taught nations a dangerous lesson. If you control the printing press, you control survival. The United States emerged as the world's banker. Under the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement, every currency was tied to the US dollar, and the dollar was tied to gold. It was supposed to restore stability, but it quietly gave America unmatched power. Because every nation that held dollars was, in effect, lending money to the United States. The empire of debt had found its capital. As Europe rebuilt and America boomed, a new kind of economy was born, one driven not by production, but by consumption. Ordinary citizens began to live like governments. If they wanted something, they didn't wait, they borrowed. Banks offered easy loans, credit cards, mortgages, student debt, car debt, medical debt. Every purchase was a promise to the future. At first, it worked beautifully. Debt allowed people to buy homes, start businesses, and live better than their parents ever dreamed. Economic growth became self-sustaining as long as people kept borrowing. But the system had a hidden flaw. When tomorrow becomes the source of today's wealth, tomorrow eventually runs out. By the late 1960s, the cracks began to show. America had spent billions on the Vietnam War and on social programs at home. Foreign countries began to demand their gold-backed dollars for bullion, as promised under Bretton Woods. But there wasn't enough gold left to cover the mountain of dollars circulating worldwide. So in 1971, President Richard Nixon made a stunning announcement. He temporarily suspended the dollars linked to gold. Money would now be backed only by trust. The gold window never reopened. That moment when money became pure belief marked the birth of the modern debt economy. From then on, governments could print as much as they wanted, and they did. The 1980s brought a new religion: growth at all costs. Deregulation swept through markets, interest rates fell, banks lent freely, and Wall Street discovered the art of turning debt into profit. Mortgages were bundled into securities. Loans became tradable assets. Credit default swaps, insurance for debt, were created to make risk invisible. Debt wasn't a burden anymore. It was a product. Governments joined in too. Deficits no longer mattered because central banks could always stimulate the economy with more liquidity. Whenever recession loomed, interest rates were cut. Each time, recovery came faster, but the debt pile grew higher. It was a new kind of prosperity, borrowed prosperity. By the 1990s and 2000s, debt had become the lifeblood of globalization. Corporations borrowed to expand across borders. Emerging markets borrowed to build infrastructure. Families borrowed to buy homes far beyond their means. And for a while, it seemed like the world had cracked the code: infinite growth, fueled by infinite credit. But behind the charts and optimism, the same old law of history remained. No empire, financial or otherwise, can expand forever. By 2007, global debt had reached levels never seen before, and beneath the glittering skyscrapers of New York and London, the cracks began to widen again. In 2008, the illusion of infinite credit finally broke. Banks that had lent money to everyone and then bet against their own loans began to collapse under the weight of their own greed. When Lehman Brothers fell, it wasn't just a company that died. It was the belief that debt could rise forever without consequence. Within weeks, global markets froze. Stock exchanges tumbled. Families lost homes. Jobs vanished. And governments, the very institutions that had encouraged endless borrowing, rushed to save the system with even more debt. Trillions were printed overnight. Bailouts became a way of life. The same people who caused the crisis were rescued, while ordinary citizens paid the price. Debt had created the empire. Now, it was being used to save it. After 2008, central banks adopted a philosophy that would redefine economics itself: quantitative easing, printing money to buy government and corporate debt. They said it would be temporary. It became permanent. The world entered an era of zero interest rates, where saving was punished and borrowing was rewarded. Cheap money inflated everything: stocks, housing, even art. The rich grew richer because debt had become their weapon, not their weakness. And once again, politicians promised the same illusion: growth without pain, wealth without work, prosperity without limits. But every promise made with borrowed money carries a cost. It just hides the bill for later. Then came 2020. A virus shut down the world, and economies faced collapse again. This time, there was no hesitation. Governments printed trillions. Central banks created money faster than in all previous centuries combined. Stimulus checks, emergency loans, corporate bailouts, all funded by debt that would take generations to repay. For a brief moment, it felt like magic. Markets soared. Unemployment fell. People spent as if the crisis were over. But inflation soon returned, the old ghost of every debt-fueled empire. Prices climbed, currencies weakened, and the illusion cracked once more. We had borrowed our future to survive the present. Today, global debt exceeds $300 trillion, 3 times the size of the world economy. It's a number so vast that it's meaningless, and yet every cent of it is a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Nations owe each other, citizens owe banks, and banks owe central banks that print the very money they lend. It's a circle of trust built entirely on belief. But belief is fragile. When it breaks, civilizations crumble. History's warning is clear from ancient Rome to modern America. Every empire falls not when it runs out of gold, but when it runs out of faith in its money. Economists call debt a tool. Politicians call it an investment. But in truth, debt is a mirror. It shows us who we are when we think the rules don't apply to us. We tell ourselves we'll pay it off someday, that growth will outpace interest, that the next generation will figure it out. But each generation says the same. Each one inherits the comfort of today and the cost of tomorrow. The empire keeps growing not because it's strong, but because no one dares to stop feeding it. Maybe debt itself isn't the villain. Maybe it's our refusal to live within limits. Debt, at its core, is faith in the future, the belief that tomorrow will be richer than today. But what happens when tomorrow arrives and the bill is due? Every empire, every economy, every family reaches that moment eventually, and history shows what happens next. Austerity, inflation, default, or collapse. The names change, but the story doesn't. We borrow to survive. We borrow to grow. We borrow to forget. Until one day, the lenders stop believing. And that's when the empire of debt ends not with a bang, but with a whisper. For centuries, humanity has borrowed its way forward, financing progress with promises. Debt built cathedrals, railways, and space programs. But it also built bubbles, wars, and collapses. Maybe the true question isn't how much we owe, but what kind of world we're borrowing from. Because when a civilization runs on credit, its wealth isn't measured in gold or dollars, it's measured in trust. And once that trust runs out, even the richest empire is broke.